It is the autumn of 1942, and somewhere over the bocage of occupied France, a Lysander aircraft is banking hard into the darkness. Below, a single agent crouches in a hedgerow, listening to the distant drone of the engine. The pilot makes one pass, then another, and then something falls from the sky. Not a parachute, not a bomb, not anything that appears at first glance to be a weapon at all. It is a small, compressed bundle no larger than a loaf of bread. It lands with a soft thud in the grass nearby. The agent scrambles forward, cuts the bindings, and pulls out what appears in the moonlight to be a perfectly ordinary-looking German document. Wehrmacht letterhead, official stamps, the correct typeface, the right paper stock. It smells faintly of the same ink used at the Reich's own printing offices, and yet it has been assembled, verified, and dispatched from a converted country house in Hertfordshire by a team of men and women whose names will not appear in any official record for another 4 decades. This is the work of the political warfare executive. And the object in that agent's hands, a single counterfeit document, a faked order, a forged newspaper, a fabricated identity card, is one of the most elegant weapons of the Second World War. Simple enough to fit inside a coat pocket, deadly enough that Adolf Hitler, upon learning of its existence, personally ordered its investigation by the highest levels of German military intelligence. He wanted to understand how the British had mastered it. He wanted to know where it came from. Most urgently of all, he wanted it stopped. He never managed it. What the political warfare executive produced was not simply propaganda in the conventional sense. It was something older and stranger and considerably more dangerous. It was the systematic exploitation of trust, the weaponization of the mundane, the familiar, and the official. In a regime built upon paper, stamps, and the absolute authority of the written order, the PWE understood something that no German planner had fully reckoned with. The most destructive thing you can do to a bureaucracy is not to destroy its documents. It is to make its own people doubt them. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, you need to understand what Germany had built by the early years of the war. The Third Reich was, in its administrative structure, one of the most paper-dependent states in modern European history. Every movement of soldiers required authorization forms. Every transfer of supplies required stamped manifests. Every civilian required identity papers. Every Jewish person targeted for persecution was identified, registered, and processed through an extraordinary cascade of official documentation. This was not an accident. It was by design. A state built on ideological terror requires bureaucratic legitimacy to function at scale. The stamp, the signature, the official letterhead, these were not mere formalities. They were the load-bearing walls of the entire Nazi administrative structure. Without them, the machinery seized up. With them, almost anything was possible. The problem for the Allies in 1939 and 1940 was that Germany had constructed this system with considerable sophistication, and the early British attempts to subvert it were, to put it charitably, amateurish. The first wartime leaflet drops over Germany, conducted by the RAF in the opening months of the conflict, scattered millions of printed sheets across the Reich warning German citizens of the moral bankruptcy of their leadership. The response from the German public was largely indifference, and from German military planners was something close to contempt. Hermann Göring, hearing of the British leaflet campaign, reportedly remarked that it was a welcome contribution to the Reich's paper shortage. The British, to their credit, took this failure seriously. What was needed was not a louder message but a smarter one. Not propaganda that announced itself as enemy material, but material so carefully constructed, so convincingly authentic, that the target audience could not be certain whether it was real. The distinction sounds simple. The execution was extraordinarily complex. By 1941, military intelligence research, later absorbed into the political warfare executive, was already moving in this direction. What emerged over the following years from the quiet country houses and converted manor buildings of rural England was a program of black propaganda that had no real precedent in the history of warfare. The principal facility for this work was Woburn Abbey in Bedfordshire, and later a collection of country houses around Aspley Guys and the surrounding villages in that same county. The men and women who worked there included former journalists, academics, novelists, advertising copywriters, and, crucially, a number of German-speaking émigrés who had fled the Reich and brought with them an intimate knowledge of German institutional language, bureaucratic convention, and cultural touchstone. The man most responsible for the operational refinement of this program was Sefton Delmer, a Berlin-born British journalist who had known many senior Nazi figures personally before the war and who possessed, by all contemporary accounts, an almost preternatural ability to inhabit the German institutional voice. Delmer's contribution was a fundamental conceptual one. He argued, and eventually convinced his superiors, that effective black propaganda must never be recognizably British in origin. It must appear to come from within Germany itself, from disaffected Wehrmacht officers, from skeptical party members, from anonymous soldiers at the front who had seen things that contradicted the official narrative. The technical requirements for this approach were formidable. German paper stock had to be sourced or replicated. German typewriters, which used a distinct character set and produced subtly different impressions to British machines, had to be procured. German inks, German stamps, the specific serial numbering conventions used by different Wehrmacht administrative departments, the precise forms of address used in official military correspondence, which varied by rank, theater, and date in ways that an outsider would never know to replicate correctly. To meet these requirements, the PWE assembled what was effectively an intelligence-led forgery operation of unprecedented scale. Paper was sourced from neutral countries with connections to German suppliers. Printing equipment was modified or replaced. A team of draftsmen, many of them pre-war commercial artists, worked to reproduce official German stamps, seals, and letterheads to standards that required magnification to distinguish from the originals. The operation eventually ran to hundreds of staff and produced material in quantities difficult to estimate precisely, because many of the production records were themselves classified and some have never been fully released. What they produced fell into several categories. There were forged official orders, Wehrmacht movement orders, leave passes, medical discharge papers, which could be used by agents in the field or planted where they might cause maximum confusion. There were counterfeit ration cards and identity documents. There were entire forged newspapers, including one, Nachrichten für die Truppe, or News for the Troops, which mimicked the style, layout, and typography of genuine German military publications so convincingly that German soldiers in the field were documented reading them and accepting them as legitimate. And there were the broadcasts, transmitted on frequencies close to those of genuine German radio stations, designed to appear as interruptions or replacements of official programming, voiced by speakers indistinguishable from their authentic counterparts. In practice, the material produced at these Bedfordshire facilities moved through the war in several ways. Some was delivered by aircraft drops over occupied territory and over Germany itself. Some was infiltrated through neutral countries, principally Sweden, Switzerland, and Portugal, via networks of agents and sympathetic intermediaries. Some was introduced directly through the postal systems of occupied nations, posted in local post offices by agents who had received the material from London and were instructed to distribute it as naturally as possible. The operational impact is, by its nature, difficult to quantify with precision. Black propaganda works precisely because it does not announce itself, which means its successes rarely appear in formal records. What the historical record does preserve, however, are the German responses, and those responses are illuminating. By 1943, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Main Security Office, had established a dedicated section tasked with identifying and countering British forgery operations. Officers were instructed to be alert to documents of suspicious origin. Authentication procedures for movement orders and identity papers were repeatedly revised and tightened, creating significant administrative friction across the Wehrmacht and SS bureaucracies. This friction, the delays, the double checks, the growing institutional paranoia about the authenticity of one's own paperwork, was itself a measure of the program's success. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. In one documented case from the Italian theater in 1944, a forged German movement order contributed directly to the misrouting of a supply column at a moment of critical operational need. The column arrived several hours late to a position that had by then been taken by Allied forces. In another, forged leave passes were discovered in the possession of German deserters, some of whom later testified that the availability of convincing documentation had been the deciding factor in their decision to attempt desertion at all. Hitler's personal interest in the matter appears to have been prompted by intelligence briefings in late 1943 that demonstrated the scale and sophistication of what the British were doing. According to accounts gathered after the war from senior German intelligence officers, the Führer was particularly exercised by the realization that the forgeries were not merely crude imitations but documents of genuine quality. Quality suggesting either access to German printing facilities or technical capability that went beyond what he had assumed the British possessed. It is instructive to compare the British program with its German equivalent, which was codenamed Operation Bernhard, a large-scale effort to counterfeit British banknotes, primarily the £5 note, with the intention of destabilizing the British economy. The German operation was conducted at Sachsenhausen concentration camp using the forced labor of prisoners with relevant technical skills, and it eventually produced notes of considerable quality. Some estimates suggest over 8 million forged notes were produced, with a face value running into hundreds of millions of pounds. The operational results, however, were disappointing. Some of the notes entered circulation through neutral countries. A smaller number reached Britain. But the economic disruption that the operation had been designed to cause was never realized at scale. The Bank of England had taken precautionary measures early in the war, and the social and logistical infrastructure required to flood the British economy with counterfeit currency proved beyond the reach of German intelligence networks. The contrast with the PWE's program is instructive. Where Operation Bernhard targeted an economic abstraction, the credibility of British currency in international markets, the British forgery program targeted something more immediate and more psychologically vulnerable: the individual soldier's confidence in the piece of paper in front of him. The German effort required the recipient to make large-scale economic decisions on the basis of forged material. The British effort required the recipient simply to act on what appeared to be an official order. The American contribution to the field, developed later and partly drawing on British experience, was substantial in volume, but generally less refined in execution. American black propaganda operations in the European theater produced significant quantities of material, but were, by the assessment of those who worked in both programs, less finely calibrated to the specific registers of German institutional language. The British advantage, acknowledged even by post-war American intelligence assessments, lay in the depth of German language expertise and cultural knowledge that the immigrant community had brought to the program. The legacy of what the political warfare executive achieved is visible in the history of every subsequent conflict in which information operations played a significant role. The fundamental insight that a regime's own documents, turned against it, are more dangerous than any external message, was absorbed into the doctrine of psychological operations across the Western intelligence community in the years after 1945. The Cold War saw both sides invest heavily in the techniques first refined at Woburn and Aspley Guys. The CIA's covert publishing operations, producing forged editions of dissident literature, planting fabricated documents in Soviet bloc countries, drew directly on the conceptual framework that Sefton-Delmer and his colleagues had developed. The terminology changed. The technology evolved. The core principle did not. It is worth being honest about what is difficult to assess. The precise contribution of the PWE's forgery program to the overall Allied war effort cannot be quantified in the way that, say, the number of German tanks destroyed by particular operation can be. Morale is not measurable in the way that materiel is. The number of German soldiers who read a forged newspaper and found their confidence in official communication subtly undermined, who looked at a movement order and wondered, for the first time, whether it was real. That number does not exist anywhere in any archive. What does exist are the German countermeasures, the security instructions, the tightened procedures, the dedicated intelligence sections. And those responses tell their own story. They tell the story of an adversary who took the threat seriously enough to devote substantial resources to countering it, resources that were therefore not being devoted to something else. Surviving examples of the material produced at these facilities can be seen today at the Imperial War Museum in London and in the collections of several universities with strong Second World War research holdings. They remain remarkable objects. Held in the hand, they feel, they look entirely genuine. That is, of course, the point. Return for a moment to that hedgerow in occupied France. The agent has the document in his hands. He has perhaps 30 seconds before he needs to move. He folds it carefully, tucks it inside his coat, and slips away into the dark. Somewhere in Bedfordshire, the people who made that document have already moved on to the next one. What the political warfare executive achieved in the years between 1941 and 1945 was a fundamental reorientation of one of the oldest ideas in the conduct of war, the idea that information is a weapon. Before the PWE, that idea had generally been understood to mean getting your message to the enemy, persuading him of your strength or his weakness, demoralizing him with facts or fictions about the state of the contest. It was, in essence, a form of argument. The PWE understood something more unsettling. The most powerful move is not to argue with the enemy's information system. It is to become it. When a Wehrmacht sergeant on the Eastern Front opened what appeared to be official orders, he was not, could not be, engaging critically with enemy propaganda. He had been trained to trust the stamp, the letterhead, the typeface, the paper weight. His entire professional existence depended on trusting those things. The PWE had simply identified that dependency as a vulnerability and set about exploiting it with the precision and patience of craftsmen. The forged documents, the counterfeit newspapers, the fabricated broadcasts. None of them announced themselves as weapons. None of them looked remotely dangerous. That was, of course, what made them so extraordinarily effective. Hitler wanted to know where this capability came from. He wanted to understand how it worked. He wanted to stop it. His intelligence services studied the problem for 2 years and never fully cracked it. They tightened their procedures, complicated their authentication systems, created new layers of bureaucratic verification, and in doing so, created exactly the kind of friction and inefficiency that the program's architects had hoped to generate. It was a weapon so simple that it fit inside an envelope, so deadly that the most powerful totalitarian state in European history spent the better part of 2 years trying to defend itself against it, and so elegantly conceived that its basic logic has never been superseded, only improved upon, in the 80 years since the last forged documents fell from the holds of RAF aircraft into the darkness over occupied Europe. The British had found something that no bomb could destroy and no army could overrun. They had found the one vulnerability that a regime built on absolute faith in official paper could never fully protect. They had found the gap between the document and the doubt, and into that gap they had poured a war.